Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's virtual event. My name is Chris Stottinger. I am your guide for the evening here with Pretty Gritty Tours, and I want to welcome you. If you're a first-time guest, welcome. Pretty Gritty Tours is the premier tour company out here in the South Sound region. And traditionally we do walking tours, guided walking tours of the South Sound. But because, 2020, we are currently doing virtual tours, and this gives us an exciting opportunity to dig into places that we wouldn't normally get to show you a lot more exclusive footage, content, access to really pull from a whole variety of resources and really give, I think, exciting and interesting tours in ways that we wouldn't have been able to as just a walking tour enterprise. That said, we are going to go back to doing walking tours here in the very near future, but we are also going to continue these virtual experiences because, frankly, they're a lot of fun. And they give us an opportunity to interact with people in ways that we didn't used to, and I really like and appreciate that. As a quick reminder, all of our virtual tours are 100% free. We will never ask you to create an account of any kind. If you're seeing someone asking you to make an account, that is a scam. So beware, scammers, loose women, and pickpockets. That's just solid advice across the board. If, however, you do enjoy your tour and you want to show your appreciation, you can always tip right on our front page there at prettygrittytours.com. We have a link pictured here for our PayPal button, and you can always show some financial gratitude if you want. Always deeply appreciated, but never expected. But it does help us continue this enterprise moving forward, which I guess is an excellent opportunity to thank our sponsor tonight, Rich and Rare, giving us the liquid courage and fortitude to do a variety of virtual tours. Cheers. Well, that is fantastic. One might describe it as both rich and rare. So tonight's tour is something that we talk a lot about on a variety of our tours, and is something that I think is worthy of its own experience. Because where is Tacoma's Chinatown? People have questions all the time. And it's shocking because when we tour Tacoma's Chinatown, we're not actually looking at Chinatown. We're looking at the space where it should have been. Because Tacoma is the only major city on the West Coast that does not have a Chinatown. And that's because of a very specific event that occurred after a culmination of events trickled up to it. But to show you where that would have been, I'm going to take you guys right now to look at the area. So if you're looking at a map of Tacoma, right where the old City Hall building is on the corner of South 7th Street and Pacific Avenue, it's across the street from the old Northern Pacific Railroad headquarters. And just down the hill from those two buildings is a wide open train yard. And that is the location where Tacoma's Chinatown should have been. If it hadn't been erased off the map, right on these rail lines, you would have seen a long section of Chinese businesses, homes, and beyond. And to kind of give you an idea of what that used to look like, we have some original historic photographs of the early Chinatown, and I just wanted to sink you into the moment right now so that you can really kind of lock it into your mind what area we're talking about. In between Tacoma's Old Town and the Foss Waterway Seaport. And now this photo comes from very early on in the beginning of Tacoma's birth as a city of immigrants showing up here. And I love this photo because it really highlights the European immigrants, a Chinese workforce, and the Puyallup and Nisqually in the time period when there was still intermingling. Things hadn't hit a fever pitch of anger yet, and it can be represented in a single photograph. Now, this photo is of the Hatch Mill. The masts of those tall ships that you see in the background there are dotting the coast. They're picking up lumber from the Hatch Mill, which is that building with the 2 smokestacks out there. And that is located right there on the waterfront that you got to see just a second ago. And those shacks with the corrugated steel roofs there, those are the beginning of Chinatown. And it's no coincidence that they sit right on the waterfront, perched on the railroad tracks, because the railroad track is the labor of the Chinese workforce in the area. It's impossible to talk about the history of the railroad or the history of America without first sort of digging into the history of Chinese immigration to the area. And the vast majority of Chinese nationals arrived here on the West Coast, drawn by the lure of gold. During the gold rush of the late 1850s, early 1860s, the vast majority of Chinese showed up on the West Coast, seduced here by promise of treasure in Gold Mountain. The reality of that experience was, of course, vastly different. Taxation laws specifically against Chinese nationals, intense racism, and so many more tragic events were going to be the reality that greeted them here on the West Coast. But they worked hard and they followed the work wherever it went. And a big part of that was the completion of the Great East-West Railroad. So the most significant event of industrialization punctuated by the Civil War was the connection of the country. And it was a joyous event because at the culmination of the Civil War, it represented, not just the East and West parts of America, but America as a whole coming together, right? And so the secret side of that was that these migrant workers were the ones who were putting in the actual labor to not just build the railroad, but tunnel through the Sierra Nevadas, through the Cascades with Stampede Pass, and create the opportunity for this to even exist. And as the railroad was being constructed and the gold fields of California were petering out, a great deal of Chinese workforce arrived here in Tacoma and followed their new passion of working on the railroad. I've mentioned Stampede Pass a few times. It is a functional tunnel to this day that the rail line still employs, but it was one of the most significant engineering marvels of the time because they tunneled through the Cascade Mountains using just hand drills and dynamite and created this tunnel that a train could pass through. And that is due almost entirely to Chinese labor and Chinese engineering at several junctures in that project. And you can see that the Chinese workforce in the late 1860s, early 1870s was a welcome and vibrant part of the community here. They were the lifeblood of the railroad, and while they weren't respected the way that European immigrants were, they were vastly influential to creating the landscape of all these places. And in Tacoma in particular, that is significant and important because there would be no Tacoma without the railroad. This city, this port town, the city of destiny, is significant because it was selected to be the terminus of that finalized project of the East-West Rail Coast, connecting the country for the first time. So it's so deeply punctuated here in Tacoma. The absence of the Chinese really is more than a footnote. It should be an exclamation point on that end of that first chapter for Tacoma. And the fact that there is no Chinatown in Tacoma is made even more significant by the fact that it wasn't just like there was a small population of Chinese nationals here. It was a major part of the reason that Tacoma was ever going to be successful at all. So when you're looking at those early pictures of Chinatown, I really want it to sink in how important to the early landscape and the success of Tacoma that the Chinese population here was. And this picture kind of gives you just the whisper of what Tacoma was going to become with those canvas tents there, the early deforestation, the manifest destiny echoing through the hills here. So what happened? What went wrong? Where did Chinatown go? It didn't just disappear of its own accord one night. What ended up happening is that after the railroad was completed, there was this population of Chinese nationals here who were doing other jobs now and doing them for significantly less than the European immigrants in the area. Also, 1873 marks the great financial collapse of the United States, in that there was a major recession, depression due to a cattle famine, among other things. And a lot of these major ventures ran out of money, unfortunately. And the people that they went after to blame for all of their worries were the Chinese, because they were easy to identify by the way that they looked, the way that they dressed, the things that they ate, and they lived together in communities because they primarily spoke Chinese, and so they would forge these communities of Chinese businesses and merchants all together. And it was an easy scapegoat for people at the time. You can see, even with Congress, there began a period of anti-Chinese legislation trying to prevent Chinese immigration into the country to secure American jobs. You start to see increased amounts of violence against the Chinese led by European immigrants at the time. And there starts to be these propaganda flyers that are dispersed all along the West Coast, but with a heavy collection of them here in Seattle, Olympia, and most certainly Tacoma. Now, it's important to note that on the Chinese Must Go flyer here, Mayor Weissbach is a spearhead for this entire operation, and that's again not a coincidence. Mayor Weissbach was a German immigrant, very recently moved to Tacoma, but German immigrants apparently were more welcome at the time. And so as he starts to drive forward this belief that the Chinese are to blame for all of the problems in America, people latch onto it and are happy to start assigning the blame to the Chinese laborers that are in the area. And they go bananas on it. Now, some people are sympathetic to the Chinese plight here, but the vast majority of people are ready for it. And you can see that vividly illustrated here in one of the ads that was running around at the time. The Chinese were vilified in every way possible, in text, in illustration, and on the streets. And this comes to a head with Mayor Jacob Weissbach. Now, he assembles the collection of 15. Tacoma's 27, we'll get into a little later, but that really is primarily a collection of these guys right here. Now, the Committee of 15 were tasked with the responsibility of removing the Chinese by any means necessary from the city of Tacoma. And they applauded themselves because they said, well, we're not just going to go down and murder them all. What we should do is just erase them from the city at gunpoint. And so they plan all through the night on November 2nd. And up to this point, Weissbach has been going down to Olympia, up to Seattle, really whipping up a fervor. And he was a leader for the Knights of Labor, essentially an early labor union in the area. And so he commanded a lot of respect for a lot of people that were already out of jobs, didn't have a lot to do, and were looking for a fight. And Weissbach, the Knights of Labor, and now the Committee of 15 get together and they decide that they're going to go down to Chinatown in the morning, 9 a.m., November 3rd, and with a bell in hand, ring it. And essentially anyone who's left in Chinatown is going to find some sort of violent end. So they go down clearing out the streets. Anyone that they find, they round up and either at the end of a hickory club or a revolver, force them out of Tacoma and then down onto the rail line. If people resist, they were beaten. If people stayed inside their homes, the Committee of 15, and this is important to the story, the townspeople of Tacoma would kick in the doors, drag the children, the women, the men out of those buildings, force them onto the street without any of their possessions, and march them down to the rail track. Conjure it in your head. The mayor of Tacoma is at the head of a mob of 1,000 people. Standing next to him is the sheriff, the fire chief, city council members, the most prominent business owners in the area, and they are all armed with guns and clubs, and they are kicking in the doors of Chinatown, rounding up all the people there and forcing them onto the street in the middle of a rainstorm with the thunder and lightning all around them, and driving them out of Tacoma to where they had to wait in a small shack, those that could fit, until the train came. And the first passenger train that arrived was on November 4th at 3 a.m. in the morning. People who could afford a ticket were out of there as far as they could possibly go south. Those who couldn't waited until a freight train at the time showed up, and the engineer on the front freight train was like, "Put them on. I'll take them out of here." Those who couldn't get onto the train at that point, of the 200 plus Chinese nationals who were driven from the city of Tacoma, marched through the rain with their children in their arms as far south as they could go until they found a place that would take them in. And this was the beginning of an entire operation in the area. It was such a brutal and efficient method that it ended up being called the Tacoma Method. And it was referenced by Olympia, it was referenced by Seattle, it was referenced by Colorado, California, and then eventually Adolf Hitler as the most effective and justified means of removing migrants or minorities from an area. Now, not everyone followed suit the same way. Seattle tried to do it to a similar approach, where they marched the Chinese down to the waterfront and actually put them onto a ship to remove them from the area, but it broke out in violence, and eventually the federal government intervened and sent the National Guard to reestablish peace in the area, and within 20 years, the Chinese population had rebounded in Seattle. In Olympia, it was a slightly different story, where the sheriff, basically alone, stood in front of the angry mob and insisted that the people of Olympia follow order, and that's how they were going to do things there. So Sheriff Williams Billings of Olympia at the time, refused to let Chinatown be taken over, or for any of the Chinese nationals to be expelled through violence, and was successful in that. Now, unfortunately, Olympia's Chinatown burned down through unrelated causes later on, but a large portion of that Chinese population remained in Olympia, to the point where, in fact, the people that were there usually had the last name Locke. It was just the name that they assigned to themselves because the majority of them came from the Locke province of China. So generations later, Governor Gary Locke, the first Asian American governor in the United States, actually came from that area in Olympia because his family remained there. Tacoma had a very different outcome, where after the Council of 15 and those thousands of angry Tacomans drove the Chinese out of the area, the Council of 15 went down later to inspect the area to see if it was safe. And it is listed in some history books as there was a mysterious fire that burned down all of Chinatown, but it's very confident, at least in my opinion, that it was a deliberate arson. And one of the things that we use to back that up is the fact that the fire departments in the area had had their hoses slashed in the night before the inspection. The Council of 15 goes through Chinatown, burns not only the homes, but all of the possessions that were left behind down to the ground, leaving it to be erased from history, photographs, and the memory of Tacoma forever. And it wasn't an isolated incident. After Chinatown was not only evicted, but burned to the ground, a long series of anti-Chinese immigration bills, anti-Chinese housing bills, anti-Chinese workforce bills was introduced here in the city of Tacoma, to the point where you couldn't hire a Chinese worker if you were a local business. And ironically, a huge influx of Chinese smuggling arrives in the area. So when we were doing that flyover, I'll see if I can bring it back to you here. That first building that you see there on the left, just past it, is the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum, which used to be, as well as currently, the last section of what was once the longest grain storage warehouse in the United States of America. And they've discovered secret hatches in it that there are some accounts that people would actually smuggle under cover of fog and darkness, Chinese people back into the city of Tacoma, where they would work illegally as a labor force in the 1920s and 30s. And with them came a great deal of opium, actually. And that's actually where the story of this tunnel comes from. In the 1920s, the Tacoma Ledger published a story about this tunnel sort of in the Lakewood area. And there was only one account of someone who said that they went through in their youth and that the tunnel was 2.5 miles long and came out in the Salmon Beach area. There's nothing really to verify that. Exploration at the time was going to take place of the tunnel, but it had been used as an unofficial sewer by the people of Fircrest, and so they ended up filling it in or barring access to it because it was so full of sewer gas that nobody could even get into it. Now, whether or not the Chinese were smuggled into that tunnel, you can pretty confidently say that they weren't, but it is part of the grander narrative of the fact that a great deal of Chinese nationals were smuggled back into Tacoma as this desire to bring a cheap labor force back in after racism drove them out. Now, when we're looking at the timeline of this, and we'll post the links to this afterwards so that everyone can get a clear image of it. It's 1873 that, November 3rd. 1873 is when the sentiment to everything changes. The great financial collapse of the country at the time brings about this anti-Chinese sentiment and boils it down to a distilled hatred in the area. It's November 3rd, 1885. I apologize for misspeaking earlier. Apparently I didn't have enough rich and rare. November 3rd, 1885, that the Chinese expulsion takes place here in Tacoma. I'll take you back to the timeline really quick. And it was there was a prelude to this where in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed by the Congress of the United States of America. Back in Washington, D.C., people were already making laws to remove the Chinese from America to free up those jobs. And the irony of a German immigrant being responsible for the tip of the spear here in Tacoma can't be ignored. By this period, the anti-Chinese Congress in Seattle was starting to establish more and more, not just rhetoric and propaganda, but actual steps to remove the Chinese from the area. And so by November 3rd, 1885, we see the actual expulsion of the Chinese from the city of Tacoma, and it solidifies Tacoma's reputation for being this place for a long period of time. Because, like I said, you look at in fact, every major city on the West Coast, all through California, with Portland, Seattle, you have these vibrant, thriving Chinatowns that have been an important factor to the city's economic and cultural growth. And Tacoma has missed out on that to the point where it's still that vacant, empty space there where the Chinatown used to be. It hasn't been filled by anything except the poignant metaphor of the railroad as the skeleton of the labor left behind, bleaching in the sun. Now, some things have started to crop up around the sides there, and most significantly is, of course, Chinese Reconciliation Park. So in early 2000, the City Council of Tacoma finally steps forward and makes the right step by proclaiming what happened there on November 3rd, 1885, truly reprehensible and something that was wrong. And thus the seeds for Chinese Reconciliation Park are born, where now the park starts to trickle into existence. And this was a major joint effort between deputy mayor, city council members, our sister city in China. So many people came together and they created this space where, for example, here it's telling the story of the Chinese immigrating out of China and then arriving here with the promise of Gold Mountain, or this belief that riches could just be picked up off the earth and then sent back to their families back home. And the reality of that was, of course, vastly different. But there was work to be had, and many of those Chinese nationals worked very hard and then did send that significant amount of money back home to their families, not only with the hopes of supporting them in China, but eventually bringing them over to this land of opportunity in America. But of course, Chinese exclusion was a hard stop to that American dream for so many. And this park is, in no small part, the artistic endeavors of Ji Lin, a fantastic Chinese American artist. And there are so many references to that experience dotted throughout Chinese Reconciliation Park, as well as these plaques that tell the story of it. One of the best parts of it for me, though, is actually the pagoda here. And I'll post a link to this so that you can get more information on it. But the pagoda is the handcrafted artwork of Chinese artists. It was created by our sister city back in China, disassembled, moved to Tacoma, and then reassembled under their supervision, and is the prominent crown jewel here in Chinese Reconciliation Park. And the park is still under construction. It is an ever-growing area that tells the story, but it's so much more than just a reminder of Tacoma's past. It is a steady gaze on the future. Chinese Reconciliation Park is used not just to remember what happened here and to accentuate the fact that the Chinatown that we could have had is no longer there, but it looks towards rehabilitating that relationship. So a great deal of Chinese festivals, cultural events, and just cool experiences happen down there. So in fact, Lunar New Year, there's always a party down there and a celebration. And it's an opportunity for people to learn more and to start to experience what that relationship could have looked like if we had done things differently. And it's important because you look at Tacoma's population of Chinese nationals right now, and it's approximately 700, sometimes a little less. And that's our peak right now. While you have, I think, 20,000 or more Chinese nationals living in the Seattle or Portland areas, respectively, Tacoma has lagged behind on that because that anti-Chinese sentiment was so strong for so long that it was woven into the reputation and the stigma of Tacoma. And now that steps are being made to ameliorate that past, they're baby steps at the very best. Now, I do think it's important because we talked at least about the sort of villains of the story, primarily the Committee of 15, Mayor Jacob Weisbach, and then later on Tacoma's 27. And now Tacoma's 27 are the 27 members who launched this anti-Chinese campaign, were responsible for masterminding the Chinese exclusion from Tacoma. And they end up being arrested by this gentleman right here. This is U.S. Marshal Colonel Albert White. Later on in his career, I believe this photo was taken in the 1920s, but he was the marshal who rounded up these guys and brought them to justice, such as it was. They end up being held in a federal facility down in Vancouver, Washington, until their trial, after they make bail, is brought up here to Tacoma, and nobody on the jury of Tacoma would do anything but acquit them. All 27 of them walked free, and in fact were hailed as heroes when they responded, or when they returned back here to Tacoma. Now the rest of the nation started to vilify these guys, really portrayed them as what they were, and hated them. But Tacoma maintained its staunch position of seeing them as heroes for removing the Chinese from the landscape and history of the city. They continue out the rest of their lives and never face any legal repercussions for what they had done. Which is why I think it's so important to remember the story of former U.S. Marshal Colonel Albert White and his attempts to to establish and execute justice in a country that promised it to a lot of people but failed to deliver on it. It's also worth mentioning the fact that Ezra Meeker, the Hop King of the Northwest, famous Puyallup resident and master of the Oregon Trail, not once, not twice, but 3 times, was against the anti-Chinese movement from the start and tried to avoid the Chinese exclusion altogether. And unfortunately, he was not successful in that, as you may have guessed from the fact that we don't have a Chinatown. And I've told you several times what's happened. So there were people that tried to stand up to this horrific act being committed, and unfortunately, it still happened. Now, when you're in Chinese Reconciliation Park today and you have the opportunity to see the works of art that are there to preserve this story fresh in the memory of people, I think it's worth taking the opportunity to note that it is not just tragic, but also beautiful and serene. Like I said, it is a look towards the future. I think one of the most important parts of this whole thing is actually here in this photograph. So the artist who is responsible for so much of Chinese Reconciliation Park, Jilin, has a series of famous commentary pieces on the Chinese force and population that was in America at the time. So this photo is actually from a guy named Andre Russell. It's unofficially called the Champagne photo, but is officially titled East and West Shaking Hands at Laying of the Last Rail, or the Gold Spike in Utah, when the railroad that was forging from the west came through Tacoma, California, through the Sierra Nevadas, through Cascade Mountains, came together and then met the railroad that was coming from the east. They finally met in Utah and laid the Golden Spike, uniting for the first time ever East and West and creating a country that was unified and free and full of liberty and justice, or so we were told. But as you can guess or see from this photo, there is a huge workforce missing from this picture. The people that were responsible for building the railroad, not just the Chinese labor force, but the African American labor force, aren't represented here at all. And so one of my favorite parts of this whole thing is that Jilin actually created this piece, which is the reverse of the Champagne photo. This was actually an interactive art experience. There was supposed to be an entire soundscape that accompanied this projection that was up on the wall, but gives you the backside of the Champagne photo. And his most prominent critique on this entire thing is called the Chinese viewpoint of the Champagne photo, and represents what was left over after the Chinese constructed the railroad and then were forcefully, violently removed from the area. And there's a quote that I think perfectly encapsulates it, that for the Chinese, this was such a bitter experience, for the railroad built by their efforts was the same transportation used to carry them out of Tacoma. The fact that it is the railroad that is the only thing that remains in the vacant space where Tacoma's Chinatown used to be, I don't think that's coincidental. I think it's very fitting as a punctuation point on the end of this entire story, unfortunately. So to take a tour of Tacoma's Chinatown is to take a tour of our city's past. And like I said at the beginning, my hope as a guide and as a citizen of this world is the very firm belief that by learning our stories, we set ourselves on a path to do better in the future. So next time you're down on the waterfront touring the space where Tacoma's Chinatown should have been, I think it's an important part to remember that we should always be striving to do better in the world. With that, I thank you guys for joining us tonight. It's been an up and down virtual tour, as you may have guessed. If you've seen any parts from our original launch tonight, you know that there were some experiences that were difficult getting this whole thing launched, but I think we've got the tech worked out. And again, just a fun reminder, all of our virtual tours are 100% free. We don't ask you guys to create an account or anything. If someone's asking you to create an account, they are a scammer. Boot them from your life and don't deal with it anymore. Other than that, thank you guys for joining us. If you did enjoy your tour and you'd like to leave a tip, right there on the homepage of Pretty Gritty Tours, we have our link right there to our PayPal button, so you can always show your financial appreciation, and that does allow us to continue to do these virtual tours in a time where our normal walking tours aren't available. That said, in closing, we are hoping to offer more walking tours in small, carefully supervised and safe groups here at the end of July. And then we will be continuing our virtual experiences because, frankly, they're a lot of fun for me to do. And they do offer opportunities for people not in the area who have difficulty with mobility and so on. This is here to stay. This will be a big portion of what we do. If you guys have any suggestions of things that you'd like to see in the South Sound region, please let us know. We're always willing to create a new virtual tour, and we always like to investigate the area. We are Pretty Gritty Tours, helping you see the pretty and the gritty in everything around us. Thanks for joining us. Keep on exploring.